In this tutorial we will create foam for this beer glass. For this we will start simple by creating basic geometry, then add details using procedural displacement, and finally build realistic shaders for foam and bubbles. So in this video we're gonna break down how we can build the foam for this beer glass, and we're first gonna build some kind of geometry that looks like foam, and this will be done completely procedurally. So we have some kind of top foam here where we have these kind of interesting bigger holes where some bubbles are trapped inside the foam. Then we have this kind of like finer foam here on the side. And then lastly, we're also gonna build a shader that actually looks like foam. And as usual, you can always find all of my scene files and a lot of bonus content over on my Patreon. So head out over there if that has any additional value for you. But now let's just jump over to 3ds Max and see how we can do all of this. So now in my scene, I prepared a bunch of stuff already. I have a general lighting setup in place. Then we have a glass that's filled up with this beer. We also have some bubbles that are inside the beer. So all of this stuff is not part of this tutorial. We're only gonna focus on here, the foam. So let me just hide everything here from the glass. And now let's just talk briefly about this foam in here. This one just was based on a sphere, and I just went in and added some kind of additional details in here so that you can see it looks like the foam is growing a little bit over the edge of the glass. And you can see it's starting with some super low poly geometry. Then we're gonna add all of the details here procedurally with displacement. So let me open my material editor, and in here I prepared already here this dummy shader. So this one is just the shader for this foam in here. Let's leave it at this dark gray value for now. And in here I have a composite map set up, which we're going to use for our displacement. But first we need to add a displacement map. So let's just add a VRayDisplacement modifier inside here. And that is now already set up to use the type subdivision, so that basically here the whole surface is being subdivided, and you can see now it doesn't look so rough and low poly anymore. Then we have an amount of 20 and shift amount of -10. If you want to know why, there's a tutorial in my channel that goes into way more details of displacement mapping than we have time for in this video in here, and everything else here is pretty much left to default. So now we can add our composite map into this displacement map in here. And once we do this, it will first do something weird because there's no base map here set up. So we just need to make a base map, and we're just going to use a VRay color for this. Once I choose a color tone of 128, so a mid-gray value, basically no displacement is happening. If I go to something higher, we have an outwards displacement. If I go to something lower than that, we have an inwards displacement. So now we can go back up again and then add our first layer in here in order to make some holes into this foam. So since we want to push the holes in, let's use another V-Ray color. And then let's just choose a slightly darker value, for example, value here of 100. Once we do this, we can see we have now some inwards displacement happening. And now it's happening on our whole geometry. And of course, we want to use a map to generate these kind of like interesting holes. For this, we can add a cellular map in here. Then let's dial in some basic settings in here. For the size, we can go smaller, for example, a value of 5. Let's up the spread here to 1, and let's enable fractal. And for example, 4 iterations to have a little bit of more details. And now once we up this kind of roughness value, we will have these kind of interesting holes here appearing. At the moment, the holes are too big and too many, so I can just go down with this division color in here and also put this completely to black. Then we only have like some small localized holes, and I think like this is now a very good start. So now I only want to have the holes here at the top of our model and then a little bit at the bottom. And I don't really necessarily want to have them here on the side. So for this, we need to add a UV map because we have to add a mask. So let me just add this UVW map. Then we can just switch this here to this Y mapping type, and then also fit the map here to our model. Like this, now we can easily add a gradient ramp to mask these holes, but let's first switch here to this slate material editor, because I think like this, it's a little bit easier to understand once our whole network here becomes a little bit more complex. So now we have here our composite with this mid-gray base value, then the value for the holes color. So if I just go in and for example make this value here darker, then those holes will become much deeper because there's a much higher amount of displacement happening in here. If I make it brighter than mid-gray, then it will start to be pushed out. So let me just put this back to the 100 value. And here with the cellular mask, we're defining where the displacement is happening. So what we can do now in the cell color, we can choose a gradient ramp in here. Let me just add a gradient ramp. Then once we have this gradient ramp set up in here, you can see now we have here the white is here and the black is here. That means we have full displacement on this side and then no displacement here on this side. There's a smooth transition here happening. We can then also make it -90. That means this value here defines the top and then this value here defines the bottom. So you can see we have full displacement here at the top and then no displacement here at the bottom. So for me, I just basically already prepared a gradient ramp, which I'm just gonna copy inside here. Then once I have this, you can see the gradient ramp looks like this. And this makes that here at the top, we have full displacement and then a little bit of displacement here at the bottom. And then here the sides remain completely undisplaced. And we have like a smooth transition here from the top to the sides to the bottom. So now we have our main holes here set up. Let's now play around a little bit with the other part because that looks at the moment a little bit simple. So let's just add a new layer in here and then move this one here below this holes layer. And then inside, let's also add a cellular map. And then in this cellular map, we can then go in and also adjust some basic settings in here. But before that, let's go to our composite. At the moment, the amount here is way too strong. I will put a value of 5. Now we can change some values in here. So let's choose, for example, here the division color and so let's choose, for example, here those two colors here to mid-gray. So we're only pushing outwards and then a size of 2. And let's see what's happening now. We can see now we have these kind of interesting bubbles here appearing. There's some gaps in here, so let's just up the spread here all the way to 1. I think like this now it looks already quite interesting. We have all of these kind of little bubbles here appearing on the surface. So now here on the side I want to have smaller bubbles because at the moment all the bubbles are uniformly equally big. So let's go inside here and add a new layer, and this one has to be on top here of our holes. And then inside we can also add a cellular map, and let's move this over here. And then now we have also the problem that it's way too big and way too strong. So let's go inside and choose here the two colors to mid-gray. And then this one just slightly brighter, for example, a value of 132, so that there's only a little bit of displacement happening. And now we can choose a different size here, for example, 0.5. Now we have all of these kind of very small, tiny bubbles in here. And let's put a spread of 1. And now we only need to place those bubbles here on the side. So this is very easy. We can just take this mask, which we did before here, and then first put here an output node. And then we take the same gradient ramp that we used to place our bigger bubbles. We also use that to map that into this output node. And now you can see we have these small bubbles here at the top and the big bubbles here at the side. We want to invert our mask so that we reverse that. And then we can play with this color map in here. So we can just choose different kind of curves. For example, something like this or something more like this, so that we have a smoother transition here between the top and the side. And now I think it's still too pronounced here, those smaller bubbles. So I will just go here lower with the opacity, for example, to a value of 50. Then we're also kind of like blending our bigger bubbles here with these kind of smaller bubbles. And I think like this now should be good in order to continue. So now we have our basic foam in place. We have these kind of bigger bubbles and smaller bubbles. Then we also have these kind of holes in here. But what is missing is these kind of like bubbles which sit in these holes. So we need to have our own geometry in here where we have something here being pushed outwards. Let's just add here a new geometry for this. So I will just duplicate our geometry in here and just rename it to bubbles. And now we can hide this foam here. At the moment, they look totally identical. So let's first, inside this displacement mapping, let's remove this texture map. And now we just have no displacement here going on. We can also add this kind of like reddish base shader in here. So we just know that this is something different than here, our foam base. So you can see now we have this kind of like reddish part here appearing in those bubbles, but what we need to do is that it needs to be pushed out at exactly those positions in here. So let me hide this and let's go inside here. We can go to our displacement composite. We can just duplicate this and then also name it displacement bubbles. And a lot of stuff we don't really need. We just don't need this and this here. And now let's just go ahead and just use here an instance of this map and instance that in here so that those two here are linked. So whenever you do changes to one of those map, it will also happen to this one in here. And now we can just assign this one to our displacement. You will see now we also have these holes which are being pushed inside. So now they are kind of identical here with the foam. You can see it's overlaying here with these holes. So let's hide this again. And now we just need to go ahead and push this here outwards. So for example, I can choose a value of here 160 would be too big. Let's just choose a value of 140. We can see that now instead of these holes being pushed inwards, they are now coming out. And if I now show my foam, you will see that here those bubbles, they are coming out of those holes in here now. So now there's still some minor tweaks that we have to do. If you check here closely, you can see some of these bubbles, they are coming through our foam geometry. That's not really what we want. We need to push in all of these red bubbles a little bit more. That's quite easy to do if we just go to our displacement composite in here and then to the base color. And at the moment, the value here is 128. That means there's no outwards or inwards displacement happening at the base level. And we can just make this a little bit darker to 125, for example. You can see then the whole geometry here is pushed in a little bit and we don't have these ugly and annoying intersections happening anymore. Another thing that you can notice here on the edges of these bubbles here, we have not enough subdivisions happening on our foam base. So let's just select this geometry in here and then just go to the edge length and decrease the edge length to, for example, 2 pixels. Once we do this, you can see that now these kind of like shapes here are much better maintained and we don't have these kind of ugly pixelation happening anymore on the edges. So now like this, I think it's fine from a geometry side. We can now move on to shading to make it actually look like foam and bubbles. So let's first start with our bubbles in here. And for this, I'm gonna hide the foam geometry so we only can see the bubbles. And now let's modify this shader here. So first let's up here the reflection value all the way to pure white. And now because they are bubbles, of course, they would need to be transparent. So let's add some refraction. Put this also all the way to white. Now you can see this whole thing here looks like one solid object. That's not really what we want because the bubbles should be just a very thin film basically. And it's not like one solid piece of liquid. So we just can enable here easily this thin walled option. Once we do this, we don't have this kind of refractive distortion happening inside anymore. And now it just looks like some very thin film of liquid and no refractions are happening on the inside anymore. So I think like this should be fine. We can just play around with the glossiness, for example, glossiness of 0.8 in order to have these reflections here not so artificially sharp. And I think like this, yeah, it probably looks quite okay. So now we can hide this part in here. And now let's play around with our foam shader. And this one, I will tell you already, in order to make it look realistic, will take a little bit of render time because it requires some kind of translucency, which always is a little bit more tough to calculate. So let's select the shader for this one. And now we can increase here the reflections all the way to pure white. Let's lower the glossiness a little bit to 0.5 so that we have these kind of very broad highlights here happening on the foam itself. And because I want to have this kind of layered effect, I will also enable here the code. So I will just add here, for example, a code amount of 1. And then we have these kind of like small highlights you can see combined together with these kind of more broader highlights. So I think like this looks quite nice in this case for the foam. And now is where the magic happens, because now we need to add some translucency to get rid of all of these kind of very sharp corners in here, and so that the light can actually scatter here through our geometry and also illuminate these parts here on the inside. And for this, we just go here to the refraction, and let's first use a refraction value of 128, and then switch this translucency mode here to volumetric. And now we'll take a little bit of additional render time. We can, for example, just choose like this kind of small area in here. And now let's up here the diffuse to pure white, and lower here the fog color to, for example, 128. Now you can see we don't have these like super crisp, sharp corners here anymore. Let me just zoom back and just render the whole thing. And I will speed up the process so that you can see the finished result in a second. So reaching this result took now roughly 1 minute on my computer to achieve. You can see we don't have these like super crisp edges anymore. The light is scattering nicely here through our foam. And like this, I think it looks already quite good like foam. So now we can just enable here our bubbles and then just render both of the things together. And then we have this nice effect that we have these kind of bubbles sitting here in the foam. And I think like this, it should look quite okay and finished from my perspective. So now we can just enable here our glass back and then just render everything together. And then we can watch the finished result over here. So I hope this was helpful for you. I hope you can use it for your own projects. And if you watch this tutorial until here, chances are that you also like the content that I provide on my Patreon, where you can download all of my scene files and watch some bonus videos for many of my classes, and even watch a whole course on car rendering. So if you're interested in that, then head on over there. Otherwise, see you in the next tutorial. Take care and see you soon.